It was just another day at work for Miranda, until she made a mistake that would cost her everything. A routine seating issue on a flight turned into something much bigger when she moved a well-dressed woman to the back of the plane. What Miranda didn't know was that this woman wasn't just any passenger. She had connections that could destroy Miranda's career, and 8 minutes later, the airline would never be the same again. What happens next will leave you questioning how far one mistake can really go. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The woman walked down the narrow aisle of the plane with an air of quiet confidence, her steps sure but not rushed. She was dressed in a sharp suit that clearly spoke of wealth and professionalism, her leather bag tucked neatly under her arm. As she moved through the cabin, a few heads turned, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She was focused, as if she had been on many flights just like this. She reached her assigned seat in the first-class section, smiled politely at the passenger sitting next to her, and settled down. Her eyes were calm, but there was something about the way she moved, the way she carried herself, that made it clear she was not someone to be underestimated. The flight attendants went about their tasks, making sure everyone had their drinks and was comfortable, but one, in particular, kept glancing at the woman in first class. Miranda, a flight attendant in her late 20s, had been on the job for a few years now. But something about this woman caught her attention. There was nothing particularly special about her appearance, just another business traveler, another face in the crowd, but Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She watched the woman as she placed her bag in the overhead compartment, her movements deliberate, controlled. When the woman sat down, she pulled out a small notebook and started to write, fully immersed in her task. Miranda hesitated for a moment, watching. Something didn't sit right. The woman looked too calm, too at ease for someone who had just boarded a commercial flight. Miranda glanced at the seat number again. There was no mistake. The ticket was for first class, but something about the woman didn't match her surroundings. Maybe it was the quiet confidence that made her seem different. Maybe it was the way she kept to herself. But Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another businesswoman. Without thinking, Miranda moved toward the woman's seat. She paused at the aisle, looked down at the woman, and cleared her throat. "Excuse me, miss, can I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. The woman looked up from her notebook, a faint look of surprise in her eyes, but her expression quickly settled back into that calm, composed demeanor. She handed Miranda her boarding pass without a word, a small, measured smile on her lips. Miranda took the pass, scanned it, and frowned. This was indeed a first-class ticket, yet something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way the woman was sitting, her posture almost too perfect, too practiced. Miranda felt a twinge of unease, but she didn't know why. She handed the pass back with a tight smile. As she walked away, Miranda found herself glancing back at the woman. Something wasn't right. Her gut told her to be cautious, but she couldn't quite put her finger on why. She tried to shake off the feeling, but the doubt lingered in the back of her mind. She whispered something to a fellow flight attendant nearby, who nodded but said nothing in return. Miranda wasn't the kind to back down easily, so she went back to her duties. But she couldn't stop thinking about that woman. There was something about her, something that didn't fit. Something that made Miranda feel uneasy, and that unease was only about to grow. Miranda couldn't quite shake the feeling that she had made a mistake. As the plane cruised steadily at 30,000 feet, she kept glancing at the woman in first class, trying to figure out why she felt so uneasy. The woman, who had introduced herself earlier as Maya, was still seated, her notebook closed and her eyes now fixed on the window. She appeared calm, almost as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But Miranda couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that there was more to this woman than met the eye. It wasn't just the way she looked or how she carried herself. It was the certainty with which she seemed to exist in the space around her. While most passengers were either engrossed in their personal devices or chatting quietly, Maya sat there, almost too composed, her every move deliberate. It was hard to explain, but Miranda had dealt with hundreds of passengers in her career, and none had made her feel this way. Trying to push the thought out of her mind, Miranda continued her routine. But as she moved through the cabin, she kept sneaking glances at Maya, wondering why she felt so uncomfortable. The rest of the flight passed without incident, and Miranda began to tell herself that she was just being paranoid. But when the drinks were served, she couldn't help herself. She approached Maya again. "Excuse me, miss," Miranda began, this time a little more hesitant than before. "I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment. I think there's been a mistake with your booking." Maya turned slowly to face Miranda, her expression unreadable. "A mistake?" Maya asked, her voice calm but edged with something else, something Miranda couldn't quite place. "I don't think there's been any mistake. My booking was confirmed weeks ago." Miranda's gaze narrowed slightly. She could feel the tension building between them, though it was still subtle, almost imperceptible. She glanced down at Maya's ticket once again, but it matched perfectly. Still, Miranda felt the need to press. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to another seat. This one isn't appropriate for you." Maya didn't react immediately. She looked at Miranda, her expression still calm, then slowly stood up and grabbed her bag. "I don't understand," Maya said softly, her voice steady, though there was a hint of frustration barely contained under the surface. "My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Miranda's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move or I'll have to call security to assist." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Miranda felt a flicker of doubt. She had worked in this job long enough to know when to trust her instincts, but right now, her instincts were telling her that something wasn't right. Still, she couldn't back down now. She had to follow through. As Maya walked toward the back of the plane, escorted by Miranda, passengers in first class exchanged glances. Their curiosity piqued. Maya walked with a quiet grace, her head held high. But there was something about her movement that made it clear she wasn't going to let this disruption bother her. She didn't say a word as she took a seat in the main cabin, but Miranda noticed that the woman's grip on her bag had tightened just a little, almost imperceptibly. The tension in the air was palpable as the flight continued, but Maya, despite being moved to a cramped seat in the back, remained outwardly calm. Miranda returned to her duties, but the unease that had started to build now felt heavier, like a weight pressing down on her. She didn't know it yet, but the consequences of her actions were already set in motion. As the plane continued its flight, the tension between Miranda and Maya seemed to linger in the air, thick and unspoken. Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something she wasn't prepared for. Maya's calm demeanor, her unbothered attitude, had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. And the way Maya had handled being moved, not even raising her voice or showing any signs of frustration, only made Miranda more uneasy. It was almost like Maya knew something Miranda didn't. The hours passed slowly for Miranda. She couldn't focus on her usual tasks. Instead, her mind kept drifting back to Maya. Who was she really? A simple passenger or someone far more important than she appeared? Miranda tried to dismiss the thought. She had a job to do. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. She was still convinced that there was more to this woman than she had first realized. Back in the main cabin, Maya sat quietly in her new seat, staring out the window. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, her face a picture of quiet contemplation. She hadn't once made eye contact with Miranda since being moved, but there was something about the way Maya's eyes flickered toward her whenever their paths crossed that made Miranda feel like she was being watched, like Maya was waiting for something to happen. But Maya never spoke up. She just sat there, calm and composed. Miranda, meanwhile, was growing more and more anxious. She couldn't stop thinking about the interaction. It wasn't like her to doubt her instincts, but something about this situation felt off. She had moved countless passengers over the years, but no one had ever made her feel this way, especially not over something as simple as a seating mix-up. By the time the plane was nearing its destination, Miranda had become so distracted that she almost missed a call from the galley phone. The voice on the other end was firm, but not angry. "Miranda, we need you to come to the front of the plane. Now," the captain said, his tone clipped. Miranda's heart skipped a beat. "What now?" She glanced toward the back of the plane where Maya sat, still just as calm as ever. She didn't understand it. Why wasn't Maya upset? Most passengers would have made a scene by now, yet Maya seemed entirely unfazed. It was unsettling. As Miranda made her way toward the front, she passed by Clara, the younger flight attendant who had been serving drinks. Clara shot her a quick, concerned glance. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Miranda didn't respond right away. She was too rattled. Instead, she just nodded and continued down the aisle, her steps quick and purposeful. The captain was waiting for her in the galley, his expression unreadable. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. "Miranda, we've received a complaint about a passenger in first class," the captain began, his voice calm but stern. "A woman by the name of Maya Carter. The complaint states that she was treated unfairly." Miranda's stomach dropped. "Unfairly?" she repeated, her voice shaky. The captain raised an eyebrow. "You moved her to economy, Miranda, without cause, without checking her ticket properly. This is a serious issue." Miranda's mind raced. She had moved passengers before, but she'd never been questioned like this. I thought there was something wrong with her booking," Miranda stammered. But the words felt weak even to her own ears. The captain didn't say anything for a moment. He just stared at her, his gaze sharp. "I don't care what you thought, Miranda. She's a first-class passenger with a valid ticket, and you've just caused us a big problem. We need to fix this, and we need to fix it now." Miranda felt her knees go weak as the weight of her mistake hit her all at once. She had misjudged Maya, and now it was too late to undo the damage. But even worse, she had no idea just how deep this problem would go. She only knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening with Maya was bigger than anything she could control. The rest of the flight passed in a blur for Miranda. She went through the motions, delivering drinks and checking seatbelts, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop replaying her earlier interaction with Maya. How had she gotten it so wrong? And why had Maya been so calm? Most passengers would have argued, demanded to speak with a supervisor, or made a scene, but Maya hadn't. Instead, she had quietly accepted the move and sat down in her new seat, as if nothing was amiss. Miranda felt a deep, gnawing discomfort in the pit of her stomach. As the plane began its descent, Miranda's anxiety only grew. She knew that this wasn't going to end with just a reprimand. The way the captain had looked at her, the weight in his voice. It wasn't just a simple mistake to them. Miranda had violated protocol, and she had no idea what consequences awaited her. She kept glancing over at Maya, who remained as calm as ever, her expression neutral. But there was something in her eyes now, something that made Miranda shiver. Something that told her Maya was far more powerful than she had first imagined. When the plane finally landed and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers started to unbuckle and stand. Miranda's heart pounded in her chest as she went through the motions of thanking passengers, wishing them a pleasant day. Her gaze kept drifting back to Maya, who was now gathering her things, moving deliberately but with the same quiet confidence. Miranda wanted to approach her, to apologize, but a part of her feared what would happen if she did. Just as she thought the situation might be over, something unexpected happened. As Maya made her way toward the exit, she paused at the front of the plane, turning to face Miranda. Their eyes met for a brief moment, but in that moment, Miranda felt like the ground beneath her had shifted. Maya's gaze was sharp, but there was no anger, no malice, just a quiet, unsettling understanding. Miranda's mouth went dry as Maya gave a small, almost imperceptible smile before continuing toward the exit. Miranda stood frozen in place, her thoughts racing. What was that? Why did Maya look so assured? Why did it feel like something much bigger was about to unfold? As passengers began to file out of the plane, Miranda's anxiety was almost unbearable. She lingered in the galley, trying to busy herself with final checks, but her mind kept going back to Maya. By the time the last few passengers had disembarked, a cold sweat had broken out on the back of Miranda's neck. She felt trapped, like she was waiting for something she couldn't control. That's when it happened. The phone in the galley buzzed. Miranda picked it up, her hands trembling slightly. "Miranda." It was Dennis, the senior flight attendant, his voice unusually tense. "You need to come to the gate, now." Miranda's stomach dropped. Something was wrong. The words hung in the air as she made her way toward the exit, her steps hesitant. She knew this wasn't just about a seating mix-up anymore. She was about to find out just how far the consequences of her actions would reach. When she reached the gate, she was met by two uniformed airport security officers, their expressions unreadable. They didn't introduce themselves or offer any explanation. They simply motioned for her to follow. Miranda's heart raced as she walked behind them, unsure of what awaited her but dreading the answer. "Is everything okay?" she managed to ask, her voice shaky. But the officers didn't answer. They just led her to a small, sterile room at the back of the terminal. There was nowhere to hide, nothing to say. Miranda took a seat in the cold metal chair, the sound of her breath the only thing breaking the silence. The officers closed the door behind her and stood guard by the window. A few minutes passed before the door opened again, and a man in a dark suit walked in carrying a tablet. He didn't look at Miranda, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly who she was. He paused for a moment, then spoke in a calm, almost detached voice. "Miranda Scott, you're being investigated for an incident that occurred earlier today on Flight 217. A complaint was filed by a passenger, Maya Carter." The name hit Miranda like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to speak but found she had no words. Maya Carter. That name sounded familiar now. The face, the composed air. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The man continued without waiting for her response. "Miss Carter is a key stakeholder in this airport, and she's already contacted the board. This matter has been escalated. We need your full cooperation." Miranda felt her world tilt. She wasn't just dealing with a difficult passenger. Maya Carter was someone powerful, someone whose influence reached far beyond the confines of a single flight. As the realization settled in, Miranda's mind went blank. This wasn't about a misplaced seat. It was about something much, much bigger. Cooperate. What do you need from me? Miranda's voice was small now, her bravado slipping away. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded and left, leaving Miranda alone with her thoughts. She sat in the cold room, her heart pounding as she tried to piece together what was happening. Whatever had just happened on that plane had only been the beginning. Miranda's mind raced, but the room remained eerily silent. She sat there, her thoughts spiraling, trying to process the conversation she had just overheard. Maya Carter. The name now echoed in her head, as if it had been ringing louder the entire time, but she hadn't noticed. How had she not recognized it? Maya wasn't just a first-class passenger. She was someone with deep connections, someone whose influence stretched into corners Miranda had never imagined. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The cold metal of the chair seemed to press against her, making her skin itch with nervousness. She could hear muffled voices from outside the room, but none of it made sense. How had this happened? How had a simple seating mix-up turned into an investigation? And why had Maya, of all people, been the one to push back? Just then, the door creaked open again. The man who had spoken earlier stepped back into the room, his expression unreadable. He wasn't alone. Another man, older, with graying hair and a stern face, followed him in. This man was different. He carried himself with an authority that immediately made Miranda's heart race. "Miranda Scott," the older man said, his voice low and firm. "We've reviewed the details of your interaction with Miss Carter, and we're deeply concerned about your conduct." Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? She had made a mistake, and she had no idea how big that mistake was. The airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, the older man continued. Moving a first-class passenger without cause is a serious violation. But this situation goes deeper than that. Miss Carter is a major shareholder in this airport, and her complaint has already been brought to the board. Do you understand the gravity of this? Miranda felt her chest tighten. A shareholder? This was more than just a customer complaint. It was a direct attack on the airline's reputation. She nodded silently, unable to form a coherent sentence. We'll be conducting a full investigation, the older man said. This will be handled at the highest level. Your actions have put the airline in a very difficult position. And now we need to assess the damage. The younger man, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, stepped forward, his gaze sharp. We've already notified the executives. They're aware of the situation. But you should know, Miranda, that Miss Carter is not someone we can afford to upset. Miranda felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had no idea who Maya really was, but now it was clear. She was someone with power, with connections that Miranda couldn't even begin to fathom, and Miranda had made the mistake of underestimating her. The older man turned toward the door, signaling the end of the meeting. We'll be in touch. For now, you're suspended from duty while we review everything. I expect your full cooperation. Do not make this worse. Miranda stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Her mind felt foggy, as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. As she walked out of the room, she felt the weight of the situation crash down on her. Her career, her future. It was all in jeopardy because of one wrong decision. She was led through the terminal by the two officers who didn't speak a word. The bustling noise of the airport felt distant, almost surreal. She was caught in a moment of disbelief, her thoughts racing in circles. How had Maya known? How had she been so calm throughout it all? Miranda didn't know, but she could feel the consequences closing in. When she finally reached the exit, she was handed a note, a formal document stating that she was suspended pending an investigation. She stared at it for a long moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened. A few moments ago, she had been a flight attendant doing her job, and now she was at the center of something much bigger than herself. As she walked to her car, the weight of it all hit her. Maya wasn't just a passenger. She was someone who had control over the very space Miranda had worked so hard to maintain. And now Miranda was about to find out just how far that control stretched. The drive home felt like a blur. Miranda couldn't focus on the road. Her mind was consumed by the events of the past few hours. Each turn, each stoplight, felt like it was happening in slow motion. But she couldn't escape the overwhelming thoughts racing through her head. Maya Carter. The name seemed to haunt her now. Miranda had spent years in the airline industry, building a reputation, earning the respect of her colleagues. But now everything was in jeopardy because of one mistake. She couldn't stop replaying the moment when she had first questioned Maya. It had seemed so simple at the time, a misunderstanding, a mix-up in seating. But now, it felt like the opening move in a much larger game. She had assumed, and she had assumed wrong. As soon as she walked through the door of her apartment, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Dennis. Miranda, they're talking about it in the crew room. People are saying she's connected to the airport. Big time. Whatever happened, it's not just about you and her anymore. Her stomach sank. Dennis had been with the airline for years, and if he was saying that, then it had to be true. Maya wasn't just some high-ranking businesswoman. She was someone with serious influence. But what did she want from Miranda? Why had she stayed so calm when Miranda had moved her? It didn't make sense. Miranda sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the message. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was from an unknown number. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. She had no idea who it could be, but her gut told her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miranda Scott?" A woman's voice came through, smooth and cold. "I need you to listen carefully." Miranda's breath caught. She didn't recognize the voice, but there was something commanding in it. "Who is this?" "This is someone who can help you," the voice continued, ignoring her question. "But first, I need to make sure you understand the situation you're in. You've made a mistake, Miranda, a big one. And now it's not just about your job, it's about your future." Miranda's heart hammered in her chest. She felt a chill sweep over her. I know. I messed up. I didn't mean to." "I don't care about your excuses," the voice interrupted, sharp and final. "What matters is how you handle what's coming next." The woman paused for a moment, and Miranda could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "I'm sending you a link," she said. "You'll want to click it. You'll find out everything you need to know about Maya Carter and why you need to keep your distance. Do not make the same mistake again. Understand?" Miranda was speechless. The message was clear, but it felt surreal. Who was this person? And how did she know so much about Maya? Before Miranda could ask another question, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, her mind spinning. She hesitated for a long moment before clicking the link. The page that opened was simple but chilling. It was a news article detailing Maya Carter's business dealings, her influence in the airport industry, and most importantly, her recent acquisition of major shares in the very airport where Miranda worked. The article mentioned Maya's ties to the board of directors, her powerful connections within the airline, and how she had quietly built an empire in the aviation sector. Miranda felt her blood run cold. She hadn't just moved a first-class passenger. She had made a mistake with a woman who wasn't just a part of the airline system. She was changing it. As Miranda read through the article, she realized the gravity of her actions. Maya wasn't just a disgruntled customer. She was someone who could pull strings, make things happen. And now, she was the one calling the shots. The panic that had been building inside Miranda now erupted. She had no idea how far this would go, but she knew one thing. Her life, her career, was at the mercy of a woman she had underestimated. She tossed her phone aside and stood up, pacing the small apartment. What had she gotten herself into? How could she fix this? Every instinct told her to stay calm, to take control of the situation. But the truth was, Miranda was no longer in control. And the realization hit her hard. Maya was already steps ahead. The power dynamics had shifted, and Miranda was now on the losing side of it all. The only question left was, how far was Maya willing to go? And what would be left for Miranda when she was done? The following morning, Miranda woke up to a sense of dread that hung over her like a thick fog. She hadn't slept much, her mind still racing with the events of the previous day. The message from Dennis, the phone call from the mysterious woman, and the shocking article about Maya Carter. It all felt like a bad dream, except it wasn't. This was real. She was in the middle of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. She checked her phone again, hoping for some sign that it had all been a misunderstanding, but the reality was staring back at her. The link she had opened last night showed just how connected Maya was, not just to the airport, but to the very airline Miranda worked for. Maya was someone who had the power to reshape the entire industry, and now Miranda had crossed her path. The realization sank in deeper. She had made a mistake, and she knew there was no turning back. Maya was someone who would hold people accountable, and Miranda was the one who had set the wheels in motion. She had treated Maya like any other passenger, assuming she was just another person in first class who didn't belong. Now, Miranda felt like a fool. As she prepared for the day, Miranda's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from Dennis or some unknown number. It was an email from the airline's HR department. Her stomach dropped when she saw the subject line, "Investigation into your conduct. Immediate action required." She clicked it open, her hands trembling. The email outlined the basics of what had happened on the flight. Her decision to move Maya without proper verification, the complaint that had been filed, and the ongoing investigation. But what stood out to Miranda the most was the last line. "You are requested to attend a disciplinary meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Your suspension is in effect until further notice." The weight of the email hit her like a punch in the stomach. This wasn't just about a misplaced seat anymore. The airline was taking this seriously. She could already hear the whispers in the crew room. She could already feel the eyes on her when she walked in. Everyone knew that Maya's complaint wasn't just a personal issue. It was a career ender for Miranda. She couldn't avoid it. She needed to face whatever was coming. But even as she prepared to head to the meeting, she couldn't shake the thought, what if it was too late to fix things? At the meeting the next morning, Miranda was greeted by two senior executives from the airline's headquarters. The room was cold, the air thick with the tension of the situation. The executives didn't waste any time getting to the point. They wanted to know everything: why Miranda had moved Maya, what she had been thinking, and why she had failed to verify the ticket properly. Miranda's voice shook as she spoke, trying to explain herself, but nothing sounded right. She kept thinking about how Maya had stayed so calm, how she hadn't protested, and how Miranda had been the one who had let her own biases cloud her judgment. "You've jeopardized not only your career but also the reputation of this airline," one of the executives said, his voice stern. "We take complaints from our passengers very seriously, but when it's someone like Maya Carter, someone with the power to make changes within this organization, it's a whole different situation." Miranda's heart sank further. Maya wasn't just a customer. She was someone who could reshape the very structure of the airline. And now, Miranda was the one who had wronged her. "Do you understand the severity of this?" the executive pressed. "This isn't just about a single incident. This is about the culture of this airline. How many times have we turned a blind eye to small mistakes, only to find out they've been building up into something bigger?" Miranda nodded weakly, her mind reeling. She could feel her chances of redemption slipping through her fingers with every word they spoke. The executives didn't seem to care about her explanation. They were focused on the fallout, the consequences, and what would happen next. They were already discussing the steps the airline would take to make things right. Mandatory sensitivity training for the staff, new guidelines for handling customer complaints, and of course the internal review of Miranda's conduct. But none of that mattered to Miranda right now. All she could think about was Maya. The meeting ended with no clear resolution. Miranda was told she would receive a final decision after the investigation was complete. As she walked out of the room, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had no idea what would happen next. But she knew one thing. Whatever Maya wanted, whatever she was planning, it was only just beginning. And Miranda was about to find out just how far this would go. The days following the disciplinary meeting dragged on for Miranda. She couldn't focus on anything. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Maya's calm face, her unflappable demeanor as she was moved to the back of the plane. It haunted her. No one had ever reacted like that before. No one had taken a seating issue with such composure. Miranda had expected Maya to be furious, to demand an apology, or to make a scene. Instead, Maya had sat quietly, almost as if she knew exactly what was going to happen, and that she was in control. And now, Miranda felt completely out of control. The investigation had made things worse. She had been kept in the dark, told only that it was pending, and that she'd need to wait for the airline's decision. Every phone call, every message felt like a reminder that she was no longer in the safe position she had once occupied. The whispers from the crew room only added to her paranoia. People were talking about her. They were talking about Maya, and they were starting to realize just how deep the connections went. Miranda had spent years working her way up the ranks. She had a solid reputation. She was efficient, punctual, and well-liked by most passengers. But now she was a mistake waiting to be made into an example. And the worst part? She didn't know what was coming next. It was late in the afternoon when Miranda's phone buzzed again. She picked it up, her fingers trembling, and saw that it was another email from the airline's HR department. This one had an urgent tone. She opened it immediately. "Miranda, we are scheduling a meeting with you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please be prepared for the possibility of immediate termination." Miranda's stomach dropped. Her pulse quickened. Was this it? The end of everything she had worked for. The email went on to mention the continuation of the investigation and the involvement of the airline's top executives in determining her future. It also mentioned that further communication from Ms. Carter had influenced the decision to escalate the matter. The words, "further communication from Ms. Carter," stood out like a flashing red light. What did that mean? Had Maya already made her move? Was she pressuring the airline into taking drastic action? Miranda had no way of knowing, but her gut told her it was bad, and the longer she waited, the more powerless she felt. The next morning, Miranda showed up at the airline's headquarters, her heart heavy with dread. The building looked the same as always, clean, polished, and imposing. But as she walked through the familiar hallways, she felt like a stranger, like someone who no longer belonged. The smiles of the staff, the familiar greetings, none of it felt warm anymore. She was an outsider now. When she entered the meeting room, the atmosphere was cold and clinical. There were 3 executives seated at the long table. The older man from her last meeting, the one who had seemed so detached, was there again. But this time there was something different in his eyes. He looked almost sympathetic, but Miranda knew better than to take that as a sign of kindness. "Please have a seat, Miranda," one of the executives said, gesturing to the chair in front of them. She sat down slowly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She couldn't look them in the eye. Not yet. The silence was suffocating, and for a moment Miranda wished she could just walk out of the room and never look back. But she knew she couldn't. She was too far in now. "We've completed our review of the situation, and after discussing the matter with our legal team, the board, and Ms. Carter, we've come to a decision," the older executive began, his tone measured and calm. Miranda's throat tightened. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. She just nodded, waiting for whatever would come next. "First of all," he continued, "we want to acknowledge that there were errors made on your part. We understand that mistakes happen. However, in this case, your actions had serious consequences, not just for the passenger, but for the airline's reputation. Ms. Carter, as you know, is not just a regular customer. She holds a significant stake in this company, and as such, we take her concerns very seriously." Miranda could feel the blood drain from her face as he spoke. Her worst fears were beginning to take shape. Maya wasn't just a wealthy passenger. She was deeply tied to the airline in ways Miranda had never imagined. And now, Miranda was the one who had become the face of a very public failure. The younger executive, who hadn't spoken yet, cleared his throat. "Given the nature of your actions and the severity of the complaint, we're left with no choice but to take further action." Miranda's breath hitched. She knew this was coming, but hearing it aloud made it feel real. "We're recommending termination," the older executive said flatly, looking at Miranda over his glasses. "Effective immediately." For a moment, Miranda didn't hear anything. The words echoed in her head, but they didn't make sense. Termination. After everything, after all her years of hard work, she was being let go. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. What could she say? She had no defense. She had made a mistake, and now it was too late to fix it. But before she could react further, the older executive raised his hand, cutting her off. "There is, however, an alternative option," he said. Miranda looked up sharply, confused. "We've been instructed to offer you a different path, should you choose to accept it." A surge of hope flickered in her chest. Could this be a way out? A way to save herself? "We understand that this has been a highly stressful situation for you, Miranda," the executive continued. "If you choose to accept, we will place you on indefinite paid leave while we reassess the situation. You will be given the chance to undergo training in cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution. The board believes that you can contribute to the company's growth in the future, but only if you demonstrate true accountability for your actions." Miranda's mind spun. She was being given a choice, an out, a chance to redeem herself, but the cost was high. She would have to prove herself, and that meant facing everything she had done wrong. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but at least it was something. How long would this process take? Miranda asked, her voice shaky but determined. The older executive gave a tight smile. It depends on you, Miranda. The ball is in your court. The decision weighed heavily on her. If she took the offer, her career wouldn't be over. But if she turned it down, she knew what would happen. Her reputation would be ruined, and Maya would have won. She would have destroyed everything Miranda had worked for. As the meeting came to an end, Miranda left the room with a heavy heart. The future felt uncertain, and her path was clouded with doubt. But for the first time in days, she had a sliver of control again. What she did next would shape everything. She just had to decide how far she was willing to go to make things right. The next few hours were a blur for Miranda. After the meeting, she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as if it could anchor her thoughts. The offer to remain with the company, to prove herself through sensitivity training, hung heavily in her mind. On one hand, it was a lifeline, a chance to redeem herself and rebuild what she had nearly lost. On the other hand, accepting it felt like an admission of defeat, as though she were conceding that she had failed in ways far beyond just a seating mix-up. She knew she needed time to think. Her world felt off balance, and everything seemed to move at a faster pace than she could keep up with. The call from Dennis, the whispers in the crew room, it was all coming to a head. The moment she stepped into the airport again, she would feel the weight of it all. It wasn't just the executives or Maya that Miranda had to worry about now. It was her colleagues, her reputation, and the silent judgment that hung in the air wherever she went. Miranda drove aimlessly for a while, letting the road guide her until she ended up at the small park near her apartment. She parked the car, sat back in the seat, and exhaled deeply. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this alone, this small. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Clara, the flight attendant who had been the first to notice something was off. Clara had been kind to Miranda, asking if everything was okay after the incident. Miranda had brushed it off, too distracted by the chaos of the situation. Now, Clara's message felt like a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. Hey, just wanted to check in. Heard what happened. Are you okay? Let me know if you need anything. Miranda stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Clara was one of the few people who had treated her like a peer, not just a colleague or a superior. She had no idea what to say. How could she explain this mess to Clara, let alone to anyone else? She wasn't even sure if she could explain it to herself. But then, as she thought about it, Miranda realized something. The way Clara had acted throughout the whole situation, empathetic, willing to listen, was a stark contrast to her own actions. She had been so quick to judge Maya, to assume she didn't belong in first class. And for what? What had she based it on? A feeling, a gut reaction that wasn't backed by facts, and certainly not by any real understanding of who Maya was or the power she wielded. Miranda typed a quick reply to Clara. Thanks, Clara. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I appreciate your message. I'm not okay, but I'm trying to figure it out. It felt like a step in the right direction, acknowledging her own confusion and vulnerability. For the first time since the incident, Miranda allowed herself to feel something other than panic. She wasn't alone in this. She had made a mistake, but that didn't mean she couldn't find a way to move forward. She sat there for a while longer, her thoughts slowly starting to align. Her career, her reputation, her very future, all of it depended on what she did next. Maya had already moved on, likely sitting in her office or overseeing a business deal, while Miranda was left to pick up the pieces. But Maya wasn't the enemy here. Miranda had created this mess, and it was up to her to fix it. The more she thought about the offer, the more it seemed like her only option. Maya had already won the battle in the public eye. She had the board's attention, and it was clear that she wasn't someone who would easily let things go. But if Miranda was to stay with the company, to make any sort of meaningful change, she had to take accountability for what she had done. She would need to go through the training, face the uncomfortable truths about her own biases, and proved that she could learn and grow from this experience. But was it enough? Could she really change? Miranda didn't know. She didn't have the answers, but she had no other choice than to try. She couldn't walk away from everything she had worked for, and she couldn't keep running from her mistakes. If this was the beginning of a new chapter for her, it wasn't going to be easy. It was going to require more than just a few lessons on cultural sensitivity. It was going to require a shift in her entire mindset, a deep, uncomfortable look at who she was and why she had acted the way she had. The thought of facing that kind of personal reckoning terrified her. But the alternative, the thought of losing everything she had built, was far worse. With a deep breath, Miranda picked up her phone again. This time, she dialed the number for the airline's HR department. She had made her decision. There was no turning back now. The next day, Miranda arrived at the airport early, her heart pounding with nerves. She knew that the final decision about her future was coming today. As she walked through the terminal, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. Some were sympathetic, others more curious, but none of them seemed to understand what she was going through. She felt like she was walking through a fog, disconnected from everything around her. When she entered the HR office, she was greeted by the same executives who had spoken to her before. This time, they were not as cold, not as detached. They seemed almost weary. It was clear that they had been through the motions with others before, but this was different. This wasn't just about a seating mix-up anymore. It was about something bigger: accountability, growth, and whether Miranda was capable of learning from her mistakes. The meeting began with a recap of everything that had happened, and then the inevitable question was asked, "Have you decided how you want to move forward, Miranda?" She took a deep breath, feeling her throat tighten. There was no easy answer. She could take the easy way out, walk away, let the mistake define her, and move on with her life. Or she could take the harder path, the path that would demand more of her than she was ready to give. "I'm ready to accept the training," Miranda said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "I know I've made a mistake, and I know it's going to take more than just a few lessons to fix it. But I want to try. I want to learn. I want to prove that I can do better." The executives exchanged looks before nodding. One of them spoke. "We'll hold you to that, Miranda. This won't be easy, but if you're committed to the process, we'll support you." Miranda nodded, relieved but still uncertain. The weight of the decision settled on her shoulders, but at least now she knew which path she had chosen. The real work was just beginning. The next few weeks felt like a blur for Miranda. The days stretched out, each one a battle between doubt and determination. After her meeting with the executives, she'd been put on leave, the time allotted for her to complete the mandated sensitivity and bias training. She had never imagined she would find herself in this position, not in a million years. But here she was, facing her own mistakes head-on. The training was intense. It wasn't just a series of lectures and seminars, as Miranda had assumed. It was deeply personal, forcing her to confront her own biases, not just the ones she had acted on with Maya, but the ones she had carried quietly throughout her life. She wasn't just learning about cultural sensitivity. She was learning about herself, about the ways she had subconsciously judged people, placed them in boxes, and assumed things about them based on their appearance, their background, and their status. It wasn't easy. The trainers were experienced, using real-life examples to highlight the subtle ways discrimination could manifest in everyday situations. But what hit hardest for Miranda were the moments when they used examples that mirrored her own actions, moving someone based on an assumption, assuming they didn't belong in a particular space. It was clear that, despite her years of experience as a flight attendant, she had missed something vital: the need to treat every passenger with respect and understanding, no matter who they were or what they looked like. The first few sessions were uncomfortable. Miranda found herself squirming in her seat more than once as stories of prejudice and inequality were shared. She had never seen herself as someone who could perpetuate those kinds of behaviors. She had always prided herself on being open-minded, fair, and impartial. But the truth was more complicated than she had ever realized. The training opened her eyes to the fact that even the smallest, most seemingly harmless actions could perpetuate a system of inequality. She had to face the fact that her quick judgment of Maya was rooted in assumptions. Assumptions about class, about who deserved to be in certain spaces, about who had the right to take up space in first class. The shame of it all was overwhelming, and the more she learned, the more she realized just how deep her mistakes had gone. There were moments when she wanted to quit. The weight of the training, the constant reflection, and the harsh realities that were being presented to her made her question if she was capable of change. Was she even the right person for this? Could she unlearn years of conditioned behavior? It was hard to see the path forward when the path behind her was so clouded with mistakes. But something started to shift after the second week. Miranda began to notice the little things, the subtle changes in her thinking, the awareness that she hadn't had before. In a conversation with a fellow trainee, someone she barely knew, she found herself listening with more empathy, not immediately jumping to conclusions. In her own life, she started paying attention to how people interacted with one another, noticing the small gestures of judgment that passed unnoticed before. It wasn't that she suddenly became perfect. It was the beginning of a process. The first step of undoing the damage she had done, of learning to move through the world in a way that acknowledged her biases and made a conscious effort to correct them. Every day she could feel herself growing, changing, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. She had to make things right with Maya, but she wasn't sure how. Maya was a force in the airline now, and Miranda's failure to recognize that before had been the biggest mistake of her career. But as much as Miranda had learned in the training, she knew that the real test would be when she faced Maya again. When they crossed paths, what would she say? What would she do? She had made a mistake, but it wasn't too late to show that she had learned from it. She just didn't know if Maya would be willing to forgive her, or if anyone in the company would. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, Miranda received an email from the airline's HR department. It was a brief message, a reminder that her leave was nearly over, and that she would be expected to return to work the following week. The thought of facing her colleagues, of walking back into the airport after everything that had happened, made her stomach turn. She had no idea what she would find. But as the day of her return approached, Miranda found herself surprisingly calm. The pressure that had weighed on her so heavily before, the fear of losing everything, was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating. She had made the choice to learn. She had committed herself to becoming better. Now she had to live with that choice, no matter what the consequences were. The morning she returned to work, Miranda arrived early, standing outside the airport terminal for a long moment, taking in the familiar sounds, the hum of the escalators, the chatter of passengers checking in, the beep of security scanners. It was all so familiar, yet nothing felt the same. This place had been her world, and now it felt foreign. She wasn't sure if it was because of her own change, or if things around her had shifted too. Maybe it was both. Inside, she was greeted with polite nods and curious glances from her colleagues. No one said anything outright, but Miranda could feel the weight of the unspoken questions. Had she really changed? Was she the same person who had moved a first-class passenger just weeks ago? Was she the same person who had let her own biases cloud her judgment? Her first flight back wasn't as easy as she hoped. There were awkward moments when she found herself face-to-face with passengers, unsure of how to interact. She second-guessed every word, every action, wondering if she was still making mistakes without realizing it. But as the day went on, something strange happened. She began to feel a sense of peace in the uncertainty. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know if everyone would forgive her for what she had done, but that was okay. She was learning. It was during that first flight back, as she walked down the aisle, that Miranda caught a glimpse of a familiar face. Maya. She was seated in first class again. Miranda's heart stopped for a moment, but she didn't look away. She met Maya's gaze, holding it for just a second longer than was comfortable. There was no immediate reaction, just a small, unreadable smile from Maya, as if she knew exactly what Miranda was going through. Miranda's breath caught, and she nodded quietly to herself. This was it. The moment had arrived. Maya hadn't forgotten what had happened, but Miranda hadn't forgotten either. And for the first time in weeks, Miranda felt something stir inside her. A flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could start to make things right. The road ahead was still long. The mistakes would never completely disappear, but Miranda was no longer running from them. And in that moment, she knew that as long as she kept moving forward, the change she so desperately needed was possible. As the weeks passed, Miranda's routine slowly began to settle into something resembling normalcy. The unease she had felt during her first few shifts back at the airport had started to fade, but the lessons from the sensitivity training still lingered in the back of her mind. Every interaction with passengers, every decision she made, felt more calculated. She was hyper-aware of her actions now, second-guessing herself more than ever. It was exhausting, but it was also necessary. She had tried to reach out to Maya on a few occasions, sending polite emails apologizing for her behavior, but she never received a response. Part of Miranda understood why Maya hadn't replied. How could she? After everything that had happened, the trust was gone. But another part of her still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fix things. She wasn't expecting forgiveness, but she was hoping for acknowledgement. That what she had done, however misguided, wasn't the final judgment on who she was. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the airport buzzed with the usual post-workday energy, Miranda's phone buzzed again. She glanced down at the screen. It was an email from the airline's HR department. At first, she thought it might be another reminder about her ongoing training, or perhaps an update on her leave. But when she opened it, her stomach dropped. The subject line was simple: meeting request, immediate action required. Her pulse quickened. What now? Another complaint? Had she made a mistake again? Her thoughts spiraled as she read the email. Please be present for an urgent meeting tomorrow morning with senior management at 9 a.m. This is regarding your recent conduct and the ongoing review. We request your full cooperation. Miranda didn't know what to expect. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but she couldn't quite grasp what might have triggered this sudden request. She had been doing everything by the book, paying attention to every detail, trying to show that she had learned from her mistakes. But the thought that something might have slipped through, some unconscious bias that had resurfaced, filled her with dread. The night before the meeting, Miranda barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she thought about the many ways she had failed, both to Maya and to herself. She didn't know how much more of this she could take. The weight of her mistakes was heavy, but the thought of going through another round of humiliation, especially under Maya's watch, felt unbearable. The next morning, Miranda arrived at the airline's headquarters early, her hands clammy as she stepped into the building. She had hoped for more time to prepare, to brace herself for whatever was coming, but time had slipped away from her. The waiting room was quiet, too quiet, with only a few scattered employees on their phones. Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew something she didn't. When the time came, she was ushered into the same cold conference room she had sat in weeks ago. This time, it was different. The senior executives were there, but so was Maya, sitting at the table, her presence as calm and composed as ever. She was dressed in a dark blue blazer, her posture immaculate, as if she belonged there, as if she had always belonged there. Her gaze met Miranda's for a moment, a slight but purposeful look that sent a chill down Miranda's spine. Miranda's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about her conduct anymore. Maya was here, and Miranda suddenly realized that this wasn't just a meeting for the airline's review. Maya had something to say, and Miranda was about to hear it. Miranda, one of the executives began, his voice somber. We've brought you here today to address the seriousness of your past actions and to discuss the next steps. But as you know, this situation has gone beyond internal company matters. It involves not just a review of your actions, but a broader conversation about fairness, about how we treat all of our passengers, no matter their background, no matter their appearance. And to that end, we've asked Ms. Carter to join us. Miranda's heart sank. She hadn't expected Maya to be directly involved in the meeting, let alone be part of the conversation about her future. But Maya was calm, collected, an imposing figure at the table. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here because she held the power now. The executive turned to Maya, and Miranda noticed the subtle shift in power. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Maya had taken control, just as she had done before. The executive nodded, stepping aside for Maya to speak. "Maya," the executive said, allowing Maya to take the floor. Maya's voice was smooth, confident, and clear. "Thank you for allowing me to speak. First, I want to address the fact that, yes, I am here because of the incident that occurred. But let me be very clear. I'm not here to pass judgment on Miranda personally. What happened on that flight is a symptom of a larger issue, one that involves systemic bias, assumptions about who belongs where and who has the right to take up space. It's something that, unfortunately, I see all too often in this industry." Miranda's throat tightened. She knew that Maya wasn't just talking about her. She was talking about the bigger picture, the industry that had allowed this to happen, the biases that had shaped every decision, every action. Maya was speaking about the things Miranda had been forced to confront in the training. But hearing it from her, hearing it in the context of their situation, was different. It was sharper, more immediate. Maya continued, her gaze now directly on Miranda. "I'm not interested in public humiliation or retribution. What I care about is change. I want to see the airline take meaningful action to address these issues. And I want to see Miranda take accountability. Not just through training, but through real, tangible actions that will affect the future of this company." Miranda felt the weight of the words like a heavy stone pressing down on her chest. This wasn't just about her personal mistake. It was about a larger, systemic problem that had gone unnoticed for far too long. It was about a culture that had allowed people like Maya, like herself, to be judged based on assumptions rather than merit. She could feel the power of Maya's words reverberating through her. This was no longer just about personal redemption. This was about an opportunity for real change. Miranda finally spoke, her voice quieter than she expected. I understand. I've made mistakes, and I've learned that my actions were part of a bigger problem. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right, not just for me, but for everyone who's been affected by this kind of thinking. I can't change the past, but I can work toward a better future." Maya nodded, her expression softening just slightly. "That's all I can ask. This is about creating a culture of respect, not just for the passengers, but for the people who work here as well. We all need to do better." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed what had been said. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't the same as before. It felt purposeful, like something had shifted, even if just a little. The executive broke the silence. "We will begin the process of implementing the changes Ms. Carter has outlined, starting with the immediate rollout of company-wide training programs. We will also be setting up a new task force, which will include Miranda, to develop better internal practices for handling complaints, improving sensitivity training, and ensuring accountability." Miranda nodded, her heart still heavy, but a sense of resolve settling over her. This wasn't over. There was still much work to be done, and the path ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in a long while, Miranda felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, something that could make a difference. As the meeting wrapped up, Maya stood up, nodding to the executives before turning to leave. She paused for just a moment, and once again, her gaze met Miranda's. This time, there was no judgment, no anger, just an acknowledgement, a silent recognition that Miranda had a choice, and maybe, just maybe, that choice could change everything. When Maya left the room, Miranda sat for a moment, the weight of the meeting sinking in. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a new path forward, one where people like Maya and people like herself could coexist in a way that was fair, just, and truly inclusive. And for the first time in a long time, Miranda felt a flicker of hope that this could be the beginning of something real. The weeks following the meeting with Maya felt like a turning point for Miranda, but the road ahead was still filled with challenges. The airline's leadership had taken Maya's words to heart, and the company-wide initiatives were launched almost immediately. It wasn't just about training. It was about a complete overhaul of how the airline viewed its passengers and employees. And Miranda, she was right in the middle of it. She had been tasked with helping create a new internal complaints process, working with a team that included several department heads and HR professionals. But more than that, she was now directly involved in the rollout of the new cultural sensitivity programs. Miranda's first few days back at the office after the meeting were overwhelming. There were constant meetings, discussions, and brainstorming sessions about how to reframe the airline's approach to customer service and internal policies. She found herself in deep conversations with people she had once worked beside but never really spoken to on such a level. She had spent so much of her career in the background, doing the job without questioning the system. Now, she was part of a team trying to reshape it. The work wasn't easy. Miranda had to wrestle with her own discomfort as she confronted her biases and learned to see things through a different lens. As part of her new role, she attended additional workshops, ones focused on diversity, empathy, and communication. The sessions were intense, emotionally charged, and often difficult. Every story, every piece of information felt like another weight on her shoulders. But Miranda began to understand how much work needed to be done, not just within the company, but within herself. During one of the training sessions, she sat next to Clara, who had remained a steady friend throughout this whole ordeal. Clara had been one of the first people to reach out to her, even when Miranda hadn't been sure of herself. It felt strange at first, working so closely with Clara on these new initiatives, but slowly, it became easier. Clara had always approached the job with a level of empathy and professionalism that Miranda had never considered. The training programs they were now implementing weren't just policies. They were about creating a new environment, one that made people feel seen, heard, and respected. Clara's approach, though quiet and understated, had become an example of the kind of change Miranda aspired to. But there were still moments when Miranda caught herself slipping, when old habits crept up, when she had to stop herself from making a snap judgment or questioning a passenger's right to be where they were. She was still learning, still processing everything she had been taught. She'd never imagined that it would be this hard to unlearn what had been ingrained in her for years. Yet, in those moments, she pushed through, focusing on the bigger picture, knowing that change took time, but it also required action. One afternoon, as they were wrapping up a particularly long meeting, Clara turned to her with a soft smile. "You know, I think you're doing a great job," Clara said quietly, as the other colleagues filed out of the room. Miranda hesitated before answering, a lump forming in her throat. "I don't know. Some days it feels like I'm just scraping by." Clara shook her head, her smile warm. "You're doing more than that. You've taken responsibility. You're showing up, and that's all anyone can ask for." Miranda felt a mix of gratitude and guilt. Clara's kindness was something she didn't take for granted, but there were still so many doubts in her mind. Could she really change? Would the passengers ever trust her again? Would Maya? Every day she felt the weight of her past mistakes, but with people like Clara by her side, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build something better. Not just for the airline, but for herself. As the training programs began to roll out across the company, the changes were noticeable. The new processes were more transparent, and the employees seemed more engaged. Miranda found herself facilitating some of the sessions, guiding her colleagues through the very material that had challenged her so deeply. It wasn't just about teaching others. It was about reinforcing her own learning, about putting theory into practice. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of something that truly mattered. Still, there was one thing that loomed over her: Maya. Despite all the changes happening within the airline, despite the fact that Maya had opened the door for these improvements, Miranda still hadn't been able to repair her relationship with her. The lack of communication was starting to feel like a silent barrier between them, one that Miranda couldn't ignore. It wasn't that she expected an easy path to forgiveness. She knew that wasn't something that could be given away lightly. But the more time passed, the more Miranda realized how much she owed to Maya. Not just for the apology that was overdue, but for giving her the opportunity to confront her mistakes and, in doing so, change the course of her career. Maya hadn't just held her accountable for her actions. She had given her a chance to become better. That, more than anything, was what Miranda was determined to prove. Then one day, after a particularly long shift, Miranda received an unexpected email. It was from Maya, and it was short, to the point. "Miranda, I wanted to let you know that I've been following the recent changes at the airline. I've seen the progress being made, and I'm glad to see that you've taken responsibility for your actions. Keep doing the work." It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't an invitation to a long conversation, but it was something, a recognition, a small acknowledgement that Miranda had in fact made progress. It felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The door was still open, however small the crack, and Miranda knew that it was up to her to keep pushing forward, to show through her actions that she was worthy of the second chance she had been given. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen for a long time. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but as she read Maya's words over and over again, Miranda finally realized that she had been given exactly what she needed: the opportunity to make things right. And that, she knew, was more than enough. Months passed and the changes at the airline slowly took root. Miranda continued to work on the new initiatives, making sure the cultural sensitivity programs ran smoothly, and that employees were fully invested in creating a more inclusive environment. The results were gradual, but they were undeniable. Passengers seemed more comfortable, the staff more engaged, and there was a renewed sense of purpose among the crew. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Real, tangible progress. Miranda, too, was evolving. She no longer carried the weight of her past mistakes with the same intensity. She had learned to accept that change wasn't instantaneous. It took time, effort, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. She still had moments of doubt, times when the old biases tried to creep back in, but she knew how to handle them now. She had the tools, the awareness, and, more importantly, the conviction to do better. One afternoon, while reviewing some feedback from one of the recent training sessions, Miranda was called into a meeting with her manager. She had been expecting a check-in about her progress, but she was still nervous. The email invitation had been brief, and the lack of detail left her feeling uneasy. When she walked into the meeting room, her manager was sitting with the senior HR lead, and, to her surprise, Maya. For a moment, Miranda froze. Maya was there, sitting at the table with a neutral expression, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. For the first time since the incident, Miranda saw her clearly. There was no anger, no judgment in her eyes, just calm professionalism. Miranda took a seat, her mind racing. The meeting started with the usual pleasantries, but it quickly became clear that this was not an ordinary review. "Miranda," her manager began, "we've been following your progress closely, and we've received positive feedback not only from your colleagues, but also from passengers. The cultural sensitivity programs have been a success so far, and we've seen significant improvements in staff engagement." Miranda nodded, but the anxiety was still there. She couldn't help but wonder what Maya's involvement meant. Maya spoke up then, her tone steady. "I've been monitoring the changes at the airline, and I've seen the efforts you've made, Miranda. I'll be honest. When I first became involved, I wasn't sure what the outcome would be. But I've seen you take responsibility, not just in words, but in actions. That's important, and I believe it's worth acknowledging." Miranda's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was Maya finally acknowledging her? Maya continued, her eyes meeting Miranda's for a brief moment. I've always believed that change starts with accountability, but it also requires persistence. You've shown that persistence, and for that, I'm willing to offer you something. A chance to become a key part of the team moving forward. Miranda blinked, processing the words. A key part of the team? Maya nodded. Yes. We've been discussing the possibility of having you take on a leadership role in overseeing the continued rollout of the programs and the integration of these changes into the company's culture. This wouldn't just be about training. It would be about setting the tone for the future of the airline. You've shown that you understand the gravity of this work, and I believe you're ready for this responsibility. The room seemed to spin for a moment. Leadership. After everything she had been through, after the mistakes she'd made, this was the opportunity being presented to her. It was more than just a second chance. It was a recognition of her growth, of the work she had put in to make things right. Miranda took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but something inside her told her that this was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment where everything she had learned, all the effort she had put in, could finally make a lasting impact. I don't know what to say. Miranda started, her voice cracking slightly. But I'm willing to take this on. I'm ready to prove that I can continue making a difference. Not just for the company, but for everyone we serve. I've made mistakes, but I've learned, and I want to keep learning. I want to help this airline grow in the right direction. Maya gave a slight nod as if satisfied with her response. I think you'll do great, Miranda. But remember, this isn't just about you. It's about creating a system where everyone, no matter their background, feels valued and heard. We can't lose sight of that. The meeting concluded shortly after, but Miranda sat in her chair for a moment longer, letting the words sink in. She had been given a new responsibility, a chance to be part of something that mattered, not just as an employee, but as someone who could shape the future of the airline. As she walked out of the meeting room, the weight that had been hanging over her for so long had finally lifted. The fear of failure, the fear of judgment. It was still there, but now it felt more like a challenge to be overcome rather than a constant shadow. Miranda had found her place in the process of change, not just as someone who had made a mistake, but as someone who had become part of the solution. Outside, the airport hummed with the usual noise of arrivals and departures, but for Miranda, it felt different now. She wasn't just part of the machine anymore. She was an active participant in its evolution. As she walked through the terminal, she thought back to that first flight with Maya, the moment when everything had gone wrong. And now, here she was, standing at the threshold of a new chapter. The path had been long, and it hadn't been easy, but Miranda was finally starting to believe that she was on the right one. And as for Maya, the tension between them had faded. Miranda knew that Maya was still watching, still observing, but there was no longer a feeling of confrontation, no longer a sense of wrong and right. There was simply the acknowledgement that they had both grown, both learned, and that, in the end, was what mattered the most. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.